All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Got folks joining up here, and looks like we're reaching a hopefully close to critical mass. So we'll go ahead and get started on today's webinar. My name is Brian Payer. I'm a senior principal at RMI in our Climate Aligned Industries program, and I lead our chemicals and refining initiative. On behalf of all of my colleagues in Climate Aligned Industries and across RMI and our partners at Breakthrough Energy and Blue Green Alliance, I am honored to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the first installment of our Summer 2023 Driving Industry Decarbonization webinar series. We encourage you to also sign up for our next webinar, which is scheduled for Monday, July 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern, where we'll help you navigate the full set of rich funding incentives, including federal grants, tax credits, and loan programs. Next slide, please. So why are we doing this series of webinars? And it's our mission to help drive deep industrial decarbonization in industry. And that in particular means major capital projects that need some encouragement. So the package of federal incentives, including the DOE OCED grant, will help unlock, encourage, and accelerate more projects to happen faster and ideally with higher climate ambition. But it can be tricky to figure out which programs may fit into your project, and it can be daunting to actually work through the application processes, details, and bureaucracy. So we're here to support you and encourage you to submit the most complete and competitive applications that you can, and ultimately deliver on these successful projects that can drastically reduce emissions. Next slide, please. A brief disclaimer about today's content and webinar. First and foremost, please keep in mind that these slides and the information presented here is for information purposes only, and we encourage you to consult with legal, tax, and other specialists and professionals as needed for your specific situation. Secondly, please refer back to the OCED FOA webpage listed here for the most current communications around deadlines, information, requirements, and anything else relevant to this FOA. They can change, and the DOE information will always be the driver. So next slide, please. Today's session, our focus is the full application for the DOE OCED Industrial Decarbonization Grant Program, and we've got a great lineup. We'll hear from Abigail Rajitsky, Senior Manager of U.S. Policy and Advocacy at Breakthrough Energy, to provide some takeaways from the concept note phase and help parse some of the feedback that's been provided. Then we'll hear from Hartej Singh, Manager here at RMI, to lead us through best practices for a full application based on our team's analysis and Hartej's direct experience in working with and winning DOE grants and ultimately executing DOE-funded projects. We know that community benefits is a focus for the DOE, and it's the #1 question we've heard from applicants so far. So we have a dedicated session led by Hadia Shirazi, Manager here at RMI, and Ben Beachy, VP of Manufacturing and Industrial Policy at the Blue Green Alliance. And they will share some of their insights from successful community engagements out on the front lines, as well as their work in helping to prepare community benefits plans. So along the way, we have the Q&A function live in Zoom. So please enter questions as we go along. We'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and we have a dedicated time at the end to answer and address those questions. There will be a poll midway through, so heads up for that. The session is being recorded, and the slides will be made available to registered participants. There is a lot of info in here, so don't worry, you can always refer back to the recording, and you can refer back to the slides, which do include a detailed appendix. So with that, welcome, and those housekeeping items out of the way. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I'll invite Abigail Rajitsky to the virtual stage. Big thanks to Abigail and Breakthrough Energy for your partnership, your collaboration on industrial decarbonization generally, and on this webinar series specifically. Abigail, over to you.
Thanks so much, Brian. Really excited to be collaborating with RMI and BGA again on another webinar on the OCED demonstration program for industrial decarb. We can go ahead and just jump into the next slide. As Brian said, I'm just going to talk about a few takeaways from the concept note evaluation. Some of you may have seen these comments from DOE in your own feedback that you receive, but just a few things that we thought were worth highlighting. First, on topic area selection, this is something that DOE also highlighted in their feedback webinar, which you can go back and watch if you weren't able to see that. That's also recorded, is on topic area selection. And Hartej will go into this a little bit more deeply, and you'll be able to see topic areas 1, 2, and 3, the details of what each of those entails. But just to note here, topic area 1 has the lowest amount of funding available and lowest number of anticipated projects that will be selected under that topic area. So if you apply to topic area 1, but you are able to actually apply under topic area 2, then we recommend making that switch, which DOE has said you absolutely can switch topic areas between your concept note and your full application. So again, Hartej will have an overview again of what the specifics of the topic areas are, but just wanted to mention that at the top as something that you should really consider, just because of the amount of funding that's really available between topic areas 1 and 2. The second thing that we wanted to highlight is this idea around replicability and market uptake. This is something that DOE has mentioned again and again, and is very important for their an important criteria as they're going to be looking through these applications. So not only demonstrating, the emissions reductions that you'll accomplish with your project, but how does your project enable further emissions reductions through the development of the technology that you're using to be scaled in other facilities, whether your own or others in the industry. Showing that ability to scale will be really critical for these applications. So just want to ensure that you're including that alongside the specifics of your individual project. And then lastly, on partnerships. This is something that we at Breakthrough Energy are also trying to help folks with, is to bring in new partnerships to help strengthen your application. Again, this is an area where DOE has said you can bring in new partners. You don't have to stick with whoever you've listed in your concept paper. You can bring in others to strengthen your projects, and we certainly encourage you to do so as well. This again could be other companies, technology providers, but it could also be universities, especially thinking if you have your site already selected. Is there a local university in that area that you could bring in to really strengthen the project and show that you're working with those local communities on the project itself? Of course, unions, community-based organizations, which Hadia and Ben will go into much more deeply, but non-governmental organizations like RMI and BGA and others as well as off-takers. So the buyers of your products. How can you bring them in to your application, whether it's, a kind of binding offtake commitment, which would probably be a gold standard that would look really great on your application. But if that's not quite possible, just being able to bring in that you're talking with them and that the, product that you are able to achieve and the emissions reductions is something that buyer is interested at that level. And then lastly, wanted to definitely shout out national laboratories, especially if you need help on more of the techno-economic analyses or life cycle analysis pieces of your application. National labs could be a really great place and resource to go to bring into your actual application to get a bit more of that technical help in those areas. So definitely wanted to highlight that as well. If you're interested in kind of brainstorming more on what types of partnerships could help strengthen your application and trying to tap into the network that's, within the BE network, within the RMI, BGA, and other networks, of the folks hosting this webinar, do feel free to reach out. I think our contact information will be at the end of the slides. So with that, I will turn it back over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Abigail. Appreciated on the insights there. And we'll getting a couple questions here. We'll circle back to those towards the end. I want to move along now to Hartej to walk us through the best practices for the full application stage. So Hartej, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Brian. Is my audio coming in clear?
Loud and clear, we got you.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. My name is Hartej Singh. I'm a manager with RMI's Climate Aligned Industries, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about best practices for the OCED full application. Next slide, please. Before I get into the nitty-gritty and all the details, just as stated in the disclaimer slide, I just want to preface my comments by saying, please reference the official OCED FOA documents and the informational webinar that was presented by OCED, as well as the Q&A spreadsheet, all very, very important documents that you should reference. Next slide, please. So as Abigail mentioned, I want to revisit a bit and talk a little bit about the topics at hand here. As Abigail correctly mentioned, one can switch topics between the concept paper phase and the full application phase, and you should consult internally and do the appropriate due diligence to see if that makes sense for your specific project. But just a bit about the topics again. Topic area 1 is near net zero facility build projects. The DOE is planning on selecting 2 to 5 projects, and you can see the anticipated amount per award there on the screen. Topic area 2 is facility level large installations and overhaul retrofit demonstrations. The DOE is anticipating to select 10 to 30 projects, and you see the amount on the screen per project there. And then topic 3 finally is system upgrades and retrofits for critical unit operations or single process lines within existing facilities. And the DOE, again, is anticipating selecting 10 to 30 projects here. And you see the anticipated amount per project on the screen here. So just wanted to level set and revisit what each of these topics were all about before I delve into the materials. Next slide, please. So when we were in the concept paper phase, the question was, how does my project qualify? Will my project qualify? And now we want to sort of change the question a bit to why did my project qualify? So again, reiterating the 4 key themes that DOE is focusing in on here for this application. They are focusing in on projects that enable deep decarbonization, timeliness to market viability, and community benefits. The areas of interest that DOE is interested in for this particular application are iron, steel, and steel mill products, aluminum, cement and concrete, glass, paper and pulp, industrial ceramics, chemicals and refining, cross-cutting opportunities that may address multiple facilities or sectors, or other energy-intensive industrial sectors. We've gotten a lot of questions about what this other category could mean, or what's an example of that other category. A great example is a manufacturing facility or a food and beverage facility. That's a great example of that other category, and that's actually an example that's mentioned explicitly in the FOA. As far as target metrics, your project probably qualified because you did a great job of addressing the reducing carbon intensity metric and ambition for the given topic. So each topic, to reiterate, has a target carbon intensity reduction and a stretch target. And it's very important that that is embedded within your full application as well, how you plan on obtaining and hitting those metrics. Next slide, please. So Abigail talked a lot about partnerships, so I won't delve into too much detail there. Just encouraging all the audience to revisit your project team and do explore additional partnerships where it makes sense. What I want to talk about here is cost share. So federal financing such as DOE loan guarantees can't be leveraged by applicants to provide the required cost share or otherwise cover the same scope that's proposed in your OCED application. And in general, deferred or avoided costs such as tax credits may not be used as cost share. Cost share with in-kind contributions such as labor is possible. Pre-award costs are allowable if prior written consent and approval is obtained. And really, really important here, cost share must be at least 50% of total project costs. And to give you an example here, for a $300 million project, the project partners, as the applicants, must provide $150 million in cost share as a minimum. Next slide, please. So as you could probably imagine, it's quite difficult to squeeze a 125-page FOA document in an hour webinar. So we're going to focus in on 2 key areas here. I will cover the technical volume and my colleagues Hadia and Ben will cover the community benefits plan aspect. But really encouraging you to read in detail on all of these specific requirements that you see on the screen here. All have great importance and require a significant level of effort to put together and have in the submission package. Next slide, please. So with that being said, I want to provide a special focus on the technical volume here. We've gotten a lot of questions on the technical volume. A significant level of effort needs to be dedicated to the technical volume. And so let's talk a bit about the technical volume here. So the technical volume includes the following components: a project summary, a business development and management plan, engineering, procurement, and construction and operations plan, safety, security, and regulatory requirements plan, risk analysis and mitigation plan, TEA and LCA projections, and a work plan. So for topic 1 and 2, the total page limit is a maximum of 50 pages. And for topic 3, that maximum is 40 pages. Next slide, please. So I want to address a couple elements of the technical volume that we've gotten a lot of questions on, starting with the business development and management aspect. The business development and management document must include the project plan summary, the business plan, the management plan, and the financial plan, and as necessary elements. The business plan must include key success metrics and high-level milestones to be completed during each phase, such as signing key contracts and agreements, securing permits, completing NEPA reviews, executing financial close, commencing site preparation and construction, achieving commercial operations, and evaluating and analyzing potential markets. And it must also address the items listed on the screen here, so commercial feasibility, key contracts, permits and agreements, preliminary site selection, market analysis, supply chain and offtake agreements, your growth plan, and your business case analysis. Key here that I want to highlight is for risk mitigation, the DOE uses adoption readiness levels, ARL. This is the way the DOE assesses risk dimensions. So please be sure to read that portion of the FOA documents for DOE's definition of adoption readiness level. It's very, very critical in this part of the application, in this part of the technical volume. Next slide, please. So next, I want to cover the engineering, procurement, construction, and operations document, known or abbreviated here as EPC&O. So key here, the EPC&O category of requirements focuses on the project development process. So the data, information, and related documents are going to cover technology, performance projections, your engineering, design, and procurement, your cost estimates, your execution schedules, and your operating and disposition plans. About the technology aspect, each application will require a technology plan. So in summary, that technology plan details analysis justifying the TRL you've specified, both your project start TRL and your future envisioned TRL, a plan for intellectual property, and an assessment of the integrated system. On the engineering, design, and procurement aspect and the cost estimates, your engineering and design should be at least 5% complete at the time of your application submission. And it's very, very important to cite successful pilot projects where applicable in this part of the technical volume. For cost estimates, you see on the screen here the framework that DOE is using to evaluate cost estimates. It is expected that when at the time of application submission that your cost estimates are class 4 or better, as defined on the table on the screen here. And as I mentioned, it is expected that design and engineering should be at least 5% complete at the application stage, just to reiterate that point. Next slide, please. So next, covering safety, security, and regulatory requirements. So this document must include safety, cybersecurity, permitting, and NEPA requirements. We've gotten a lot of questions about permitting and what sort of permitting information is required as part of the technical volume. So applications must include a permitting workflow overview that identifies anticipated state, federal, tribal, local codes, regulations, and permitting requirements applicable to siting, construction, and operation of the proposed project. Additionally, the integrated project schedule, the acronym for that DOE uses is IPS. The integrated project schedule should clearly identify and incorporate timelines for application and expected completion or receipt of all federal, state, tribal, and local permits, approvals, or reviews. And projects that have pre-approved sites cooperation agreements with local authorities or expedited permitting processes should outline such agreements and incorporate them into the overall work plan and mention that in this safety, security, and regulatory requirement as well. Next slide, please. So covering TEA, techno-economic analysis, TEA, and lifecycle cost analysis, lifecycle analysis, LCA projections. So this document, so each application must include a preliminary TEA and LCA at an integrated systems level. Applicants are strongly encouraged to use the provided industrial demonstrations, TEA assumptions, Excel templates on the OCED website, and the LCA template on the OCED website. The DOE, just to reiterate the comments that I made on the first couple of slides, the OCED website contains a large library of templates, guidance documents, etc. Please do take advantage of that. The important component that I want to highlight here is that it's extremely important to define assumptions, rationales, and system boundaries. Very, very critically is describing the baseline for benchmarking that you're using for your LCA analysis. It's important to characterize what the state of the art is for the particular industry or project that you're working on. This figure here you see on the screen describes or illustrates an example of key industrial facility TEA and LCA components, just to give you an idea. We've gotten a lot of questions on what's the difference between the cost estimates portion of the EPC&O plan and this document. Well, the TEA is meant to describe the long-term financial viability of the business and include aspects like tax credits and revenue. The cost estimates aspect is specifically focused on your unit operations and the CapEx associated with those, just to distinguish between the two. Next slide, please. So this slide is really important to set the stage on where we are in the process. So right now we're in the application phase. If you're listening to this webinar today, you've probably been encouraged to submit the full application. And it's important to understand that the key elements of the project, the assumptions, the key inputs, such as the LCA, your emissions analysis, your cost estimates, are going to continually be refined throughout the course of the project life. So this is not a one and done situation where you hit submit and you're bound to those estimates and inputs for the project life. It's important to have a high level of fidelity in what you're submitting, but that's not to say that your estimates can't be refined as the project proceeds. So just wanted to put that out there to level set that this is not the end all be all, and there'll be many opportunities to continue refining your project estimates. Next slide, please. So discussing a bit about evaluation criteria here. So the applicants and proposed teams, they must have the qualifications, experience, and capabilities and other resources necessary to design, develop, build, and operate the proposed project and successfully address the following criterion. So going through these criterion here, the first one is technical merit, innovation, and impact. This is the highest weighted scoring criteria. Criterion 2 is financial and market viability. Criterion 3 is your work plan. Criterion 4 is your management team and your project partners. And Criterion 5 is your community benefits plan. And I'll talk a bit about how you should think about incorporating these weightings as you write your technical volume and pull together your application. Next slide, please. So best practices for putting together a full application. It's really important to be mindful of your audience as you write the full application. It's important to remember that this is not an engineering or a sales document, but rather a grant application to be reviewed by DOE program managers and reviewers. It's important to allocate pages in the technical volume in accordance with how heavily that section is weighted in the evaluation criteria. And to give you an example of that, the work plan, as we saw on the previous slide, has a 15% weight in the overall scoring criteria. As such, it should not represent 25 plus pages of the 50 pages of your technical volume. It's important to address long lead time items like letters of commitment early on. So get those templates and requests out the door as soon as possible, because they definitely take a couple weeks to get addressed. If external third-party assistance is needed on any component of the application, whether that's tax assistance, legal counsel, assistance with the LCA modeling, it's really critical to bring those resources on ASAP. As I mentioned in the first couple slides, please be familiar with cost share requirements and establish how applicants will split funding amongst project partners as soon as possible in the full application process. And last but not least, do not underestimate the level of effort required for all the administrative forms and tasks associated with the full application. So this includes things like compiling resumes, filling out your budget justification form, the summary slides, the current and pending support disclosures, your lobbying disclosure, all very, very important stuff. And you do not want to be caught on the last day pulling these all together in the final hours before the submission deadline. Definitely avoid that. And if your organizational bandwidth allows for it, we strongly recommend dedicating one point person to help compile and complete all these administrative items well before the submission deadline. So with that, I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Brian. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Hartej. We sincerely appreciate your time to walk us through that element and add your expertise on best practices. So we'll now go to an audience poll. So everybody will give you a little chance to debrief here between our dense sections. So the first is we want to know about the project help, and we'll give you about 30 seconds here to key in the answers, but which aspect of your project or application do you need the most help with? Is it on the technology section? Is it around the finance and market viability and offtake? Is it about project management, community benefits plan, or something else? Already still see a couple of responses trickling in here. All right, seems like responses have slowed down. Last chance, 3, 2, 1. All right, we're gonna end our poll. Let's see. So are the results shared up there now? I think it looks pretty clear that the community benefits plan got more than half the results. That's a good thing. I'm glad that we anticipated that, and that's going to be our next section. So we'll cover that. Next most popular response being the finance, market viability, and offtake sections. Okay, so that's interesting and helpful feedback. Couple of folks on technology, project management, and other, but appreciate that one. So we've got one more question for you. If we can go to question number 2 on the poll, is we are curious what project stage, how far along are you in submitting this full application and getting ready to complete it before the August 11th deadline? Okay, we've got, looks like the last couple of results trickling in here. Anyone wants to cue in a little bit more? All right, 3, 2, 1, and let's call it on the poll. So it looks like a lot of folks have a lot of work to do. Sorry, with the 80-20 here is pretty clear that most folks are just getting started on the full application. So hopefully this is a very useful and timely webinar for you to help your best practices there. And certainly as Hartej has gone through, making sure that you get the appropriate team and support to work through these these different items. So thank you all for sharing on that brief audience poll. Let's move along to our next section in the presentation. So this is community development, which again, many of you are quite interested in. So we have Hadia and Ben, who will do a bit of tag team to present the best practices here. So I will invite Hadia Shirazi to the virtual stage. Hadia is a manager here at RMI and has deep experience in both frontline work with communities as well as developing effective community benefits plans. So Hadia, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone. So a critical element of many major federal funding opportunities under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act is a whole of government commitment to direct 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments towards advancing environmental justice and catalyzing economic opportunity for low-income, Indigenous, and communities of color in the United States that have historically been underserved, disproportionately impacted by underinvestment, and overburdened by legacy pollution for generations. To that end, the applicants who will be submitting full applications under this FOA are asked to provide details of their plans for community benefits, or CBPs, including community benefit agreements, referred to as CBAs, that will build public trust, de-risk projects, secure community input and buy-in for shared prosperity will be key to a just energy transition. The DOE expects awardees to continually track, monitor, and report all possible benefits and any and all negative impacts that will flow to communities, especially disadvantaged communities that have had disproportionate overexposure to cumulative legacy pollution. Next slide, please. I'll be covering some key elements and milestones that will inform your CBP planning process and also support the ultimate negotiation of well-rounded community benefit agreements that are responsive to local needs and concerns. I refer you to the FOA resources on this slide for useful templates, requirements, and very helpful detailed step-by-step guidelines. We've also linked up previous webinar to help with stakeholder mapping and identification activities, as well as the most recent 101 webinar hosted by the Department of Energy that provides a general overview as well. Next slide, please. The required documentation includes the CBP, partnership documentation to demonstrate existing or planned partnerships with tribes and community entities, which can be in the form of letter on the partner's letterhead, clearly outlining the planned partnership, signed by an officer of the entity, an MOU or similar agreement. It must also include responses to the environmental considerations summary section, as federal funds under this opportunity are subject to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Please do consult with appropriate experts or colleagues in-house to fill out these responses with as much detail as you may currently have, as if your proposal is selected, this information will be used by the DOE to determine the right level of NEPA review. Given the very limited page restrictions and the very tight amount of space available, we recommend using your space strategically. Pages 10 through 12 of the FOA note that you can use maps, geospatial tools, comparative tables, network analysis diagrams, stakeholder maps to illustrate relationships and power dynamics between local groups. You can use timelines of key impactful socioeconomic and environmental developments in the region. A stakeholder analysis matrix is not required, but it can be helpful for grouping by sectoral and geographic categories. Next slide, please. By now, we're pretty familiar with the 5 key requirements of the community benefits section: meaningful community and labor engagement, supporting quality jobs, advancing DEIA, contributing to the goals of Justice 40 initiative, and priority consideration for projects that provide the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. Altogether, these will count towards 20% of the overall project score. Next slide, please. A quick reference to the DOE's outline from vision to implementation stages for this FOA. Next slide, please. Now on to the process. This is just a reference slide for an at-a-glance look at all the various types of activities, like background research on the area, all possible impacted groups, identification of disadvantaged communities, existing socioeconomic and environmental burdens, and the multiple stages of feedback and input from key stakeholders, especially traditionally marginalized groups. All of these activities are critical and required input for responsive CBP planning and ultimately reaching an agreement. We're going to highlight the most important elements for each section on what makes a strong, good section, and we'll share some pro tips and address some of the most frequently asked questions from project developers. Next slide, please. A good community and labor engagement plan will be transparent and two-way in communication, feedback, and responsiveness, and demonstrate internal or in-house capabilities, as well as sufficient resources to conduct all the mapping, engagement, monitoring and tracking reporting activities over all phases over the full life cycle of the project. Next slide, please. Here is a visualization of various activities that could be undertaken in the lead up to a community benefits agreement. While this is a 6-stage timeline example, the timeline you end up adopting for your project should be a good match between the project phase and engagement methods for maximum cost effectiveness and timely execution. And that includes activities like design and permitting, construction, operations, and then even decommissioning or demolition. We have the understanding that demonstrating transparency and building relationships and trust with stakeholders to negotiate agreements takes time, especially if this is a totally new project or if historically important local relationships have been strained. In this example, the developer could start by publicizing their findings from all their background research and initial engagements or past engagements with community and labor groups on the company website. Or, depending on the local context, for example, low broadband access or energy inequity, make hard copies of these materials available in public venues like post offices, city hall, community centers, or faith-based organizations. Next, you could conduct further interviews virtually or in person to gather more feedback, take care to include traditionally marginalized groups. And then for stage 3, you will begin to identify the top priorities and concerns for community and labor groups, and then internally brainstorm how to develop or modify your project plans to incorporate this feedback. Stage 4 involves follow-ups, like weekly phone calls with local community and labor leaders, elected officials, community organizations, to help identify individuals and groups who have expertise in health, housing, jobs, or workforce development areas. For the next phase in preparation for the CBA, you want to allocate staff and budget to these activities, including maybe hiring a third-party expert or a neutral specialist to facilitate the process. And finally, in the last stage, publicize your plans to negotiate a community benefit agreement. Share who will be leading this process internally and externally, and continue to capture feedback, offer training in the CBA process for the wider public, and include input into even the timeline of the process. Next slide, please. So, pro tips for identifying all the possible labor groups that may be impacted by the project. Here's a quick list of resources for information from unions to trade councils, apprenticeship programs, and state and community workforce development boards and job centers. Next slide, please. Another popular question is on how to include traditionally excluded or marginalized groups, such as disabled individuals, veterans, non-English speaking or immigrant groups, the elderly, and returned citizens. Options include offering language and disability accessibility, transportation, care costs, in-person or hybrid options, and food or even compensation for time contributions. And now I'll hand over to Ben Beachy to cover the next 2 sections on workforce and DEIA.
Hey there, good to be with you all. Thank you, Hadia. So my name is Ben. I'm based at the Blue Green Alliance, and if you're not familiar with us, we are a national coalition of 13 national unions and environmental organizations, and we work to unite union and environmental organizations on policy solutions that are pro-climate, pro-jobs, and pro-justice. Community benefits plans are right in our bailiwick. I'm our VP for industrial policy. So I'm going to walk through the next 2 buckets of the community benefits plan, investing in the American workforce by supporting quality jobs. Again, the caveat given by the other speakers, I would give again that DOE is the authority here, and you should certainly consult their documents. To give you a quick synopsis, I thought it would be helpful to start with some brass tacks. Like what are we actually looking for to show that the jobs created would be quality jobs with respect for workers' rights? And I would first start with the fact that there's 3 categories in the investing in the American workforce. There's quality jobs, workforce development, and workers' rights. You see all 3 categories outlined in DOE's own guidance on this. So to pick apart quality jobs and drill down to what we actually mean, we're first of all talking about quality jobs across not just manufacturing, the operations jobs, but also the construction jobs and other jobs in related parts of the supply chain. To name a couple of specifics that you could name check in your application, a number of these specifics were cited actually in DOE's own guidance as indicators of seriousness in committing to quality jobs, workforce development, and workers' rights. So to the extent you can be very specific in naming what you would be committing to, it certainly positions your application better for acceptance. The first under quality jobs that I would name is project labor agreements and related agreements, community workforce and community benefits agreements, which Heidi just touched on. These are kind of catch-all agreements that can encompass many of these other bullets that you see here. So project labor agreements are specific to construction, and they are signed with a construction union and allow for a smoother process, a more on-time process for the construction phase of the project, as well as entitling the union and the local community to certain benefits, such as local hire and a couple of other things I'll name. For community benefits agreements, Heidi just named some of the steps to get to a CBA, community benefits agreement, and I have a slide at the very end that I'll reserve for right now on what can go into a CBA. On thing number 2, wages. Committing to adherence to Davis-Bacon Act is certainly useful. It's a baseline standard. Davis-Bacon Act requires contractors and project operators to pay prevailing wages to construction workers and also offer fringe benefits. You can go one better, though, than committing to prevailing wages and actually commit to living wages, which really take into account the cost of living, the full cost of living in the local area, and offering to pay workers whatever that cost is. On terms of benefits, I think it's helpful to name check the full range of benefits that would be offered, including 401k contributions for retirement, fringe benefits like health insurance, paid time off, and bonuses. In terms of who would be hired, local hire is often sought as a commitment to supporting the local economy, and targeted hire, which I'll get into in just a second when talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Abiding by federal law is certainly something that should be referenced. Abiding by OSHA standards, regulations to ensure worker safety, and the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, which basically governs overtime pay. The last thing I'll name on quality jobs is making sure that, and it's helpful to be explicit here, just that the workers will be actually classified as employees, not misclassified as independent contractors, which is a scheme that some employers have used to try to get out of overtime pay and other commitments. On workforce development, it's helpful, again, to be as specific as possible. So I would name for manufacturing workforce development, manufacturing unions often work together with management to create union-affiliated training programs that provide on-the-job training for manufacturing workers. In addition, for construction, you have both registered apprenticeship programs and pre-apprenticeship programs, which are similar in that they offer on-the-job training, so you can learn while doing and get paid from the worker standpoint. And from the employer standpoint, they, especially in this tight labor market, have created an on-ramp for skilled, stable workforce that many employers are looking for, particularly today. Pre-apprenticeships, I'll reserve for when I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. On workers' rights, here the main thing is to show that support or at least neutrality for unions, for workers' right to freely join unions and to collectively bargain. The gold standard here is a labor neutrality agreement, which essentially is the employer's commitment to not interfere in a union organizing drive. Labor peace agreement is similar. It's a commitment from the employer not to interfere in an organizing drive. From the union standpoint, also commits to not doing work stoppages and a few other things during this time. Both of those, really ensure a more collaborative approach to unions, a smoother process, a less time or time intensive or expensive process in working together with unions. Collective bargaining agreements, if you already have one with a union, certainly helpful to name check that. If there's openness to negotiating one with a union, it's helpful to also name check that. Next slide. So real briefly, that was the what. This is the how for investing in America's workforce. Again, looking across not only what could be done in the short term, but thinking about the medium and long term, and spelling out how these different assurances for quality jobs and engagement with unions will actually be accomplished over the duration of the project. Fully considering the benefits for workers across the entire workforce. That includes construction, manufacturing, operations, maintenance, and beyond. And then getting very specific about how exactly this is going to be pulled off. So naming the personnel and budget that will be committed to ensuring quality jobs, workforce development, and respect for workers' rights. Being two-way, and simply that this is a negotiation with the workforce, namely with the union. And so it would be a two-way communication to determine the specifics. Next slide. Advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is the next big ticket item in community benefits plans. And it includes equitable hiring and training, which means, again, the rule of the day is to be as specific as you can be to show seriousness. So detailing specific targets and plans that you have for hiring and training underrepresented workers. Underrepresented is really a term that can vary depending on your location on who exactly is underrepresented, but frequently women, workers of color, veterans, formerly incarcerated people are all underrepresented in the workforce in certain industries, certainly in the industrial sector. Just a word that it's important to have targets, but not quotas. You're not allowed to actually have hiring quotas by law, but you can name specific targets that you are aiming for. Pre-apprenticeship programs are important to invoke here for the construction trades, particularly because pre-apprenticeship programs are typically designed to provide on-ramps for underrepresented workers to have good career pathways in construction trades. Equitable contracting, similarly be specific in your plans for contracting with businesses that are owned by women or people of color or veterans or others who are underrepresented in business ownership. Enforcing the law, it's helpful to just name specific workplace policies that conform to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act or the American Disabilities Act, which are some of our bedrock non-discrimination laws. And lastly, building an inclusive workplace. It's not enough just to have equitable hiring and targeting, but you want to make sure that existing staff and the workplace overall is an inclusive workplace. And that means doing training probably for staff, including, for example, implicit bias training, creating channels for feedback on how the company can improve on DIA, and actually having diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility as part of both the strategic planning process and the process of evaluating staff to see how well staff are upholding DIA principles. Next slide. So this is basically saying, once again, to be specific, including specific milestones, naming roles and responsibilities, and also avoid tokenization. One thing you definitely do not want to do is, in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion, to bring in underrepresented workers and then assign them the task of improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is putting an undue burden, of course, on underrepresented workers. So suggestion here to hire some external consultants and experts if needed to support this work. Next slide. Last thing I will name is community benefits agreements. Hadia walked through some of the steps, so I will not belabor those, but you see a quick synopsis there on the right for some steps to negotiate a successful CBA. What I'll say is, just to reiterate what a CBA is, it is a legally binding agreement between a company, a community coalition, and a union that outlines specific benefits for workers and communities in exchange for their explicit support for a project. So the value proposition for the company is ensures both workforce and community support for the project going forward. The value proposition for workers and communities is very real, tangible, on the ground benefits in a legally binding contract. A couple of tips. It's important to engage on both the union side and the community side. They'll both be coming together, and most likely. It's important to start the process early in the design phase. Community benefits agreements are not a hortatory last-minute box checking exercises. These are real, meaningful two-way engagement, and so starting early can help to show commitment to that. It's helpful to name that you're open to committing to a legally binding agreement. And while you would not be able to necessarily prejudge all of the content of a community benefits agreement, because it is a two-way conversation with community groups and workforce, naming some specific benefits that you would be open to including can only help the cause as well, such as labor standards that were already named, equitable job training and placement, equitable hiring and procurement targets as already named, health and safety standards, both for the workforce and the local community, so environmental health, community benefits fund, which is putting some of the business's own money into a fund that the community itself controls for economic development, and specific dispute resolution mechanisms to ensure that the community benefits agreement is upheld. There on the right, you'll see a couple of toolkits if you would like more information, real deep dive on CBAs. I'll pass it back to Hadia.
Thank you, Ben. So for a good, gracious benefits section, please use SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely metrics to track all possible known and potential future benefits, as well as negative impacts, and also include an understanding of how these impacts may evolve over time, over that full life cycle of the project, as that will be closely monitored by the DOE in awarding go, no-go at each phase of the project. And please also remember to discuss the tools and methods for measuring, tracking, and reporting. And that even includes instruments that you might be using or specific technologies to monitor air pollution, for instance. Next slide, please. Another popular question is on what types of negative impacts should be considered. This is a non-exhaustive list of negative impacts. You should definitely include others that may not fall into one of these broad categories. For this FOA, it's especially important to remember that the DOE has asked applicants to address localized impacts related to changes in air pollution, that's NOx, SOx, and particulate matter, water pollution, the hazardous waste streams, and quality jobs. Next slide, please. Lastly, for the Justice 40 initiative, a good section will demonstrate a deep and thorough understanding of how project impacts on surrounding frontline or fence line communities adjacent to the development, labor unions, and any federally recognized tribal entities could increase, decrease, or combine with existing burdens like air pollution, energy insecurity, water stress, etc., that are already faced by disadvantaged communities that have been previously identified using EJ Screen, the CGES tool, or any other geospatial analytical tools. Remember to detail the robust mechanisms that you've designed to ensure accountability and responsiveness to community feedback. Next slide, please. So another common question that we often get is, well, what if there are no people living near the project site? And or what if there are also no disadvantaged communities around the site or anywhere near the area of the project? In that case, you can identify upstream and downstream communities that could be impacted by air pollution, water usage, water pollution, other types of pollution, or potentially job losses. You can also consider providing benefits to the next closest disadvantaged communities or the most overburdened disadvantaged communities in your state, or partner with local government or community organizations that are serving disadvantaged communities. You can also partner with universities and local faith-based organizations to provide targeted benefits. Next slide, please. For your convenience, here is a checklist of all the subheadings that will be required for each of the 5 sections. Next slide, please. So these 2 slides will list all the evaluation criteria, and they can both be found in the appendix for your reference. Next slide, please. And on to the next. Lastly, here is a quick registration checklist. And on the next slide, we have a list of useful resources and links. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll hand it back to Brian Pear for Q&A.
All right, Hadia, Ben, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and going through that detailed information on community benefits. We're grateful for all of that information as it comes forward. So now we have about 35 minutes left in our time here on the webinar. So I will queue up the Q&A. So thank you to many of you who have entered questions into the Q&A roster. If you have questions that you are sitting on at the moment, please keep entering them. So please, we've got a roster queued up now, and generally what I'd like to do is let's have Hadia and Ben. We've got a couple of questions related to community benefits, so why don't you guys come back on camera and we'll address those questions right now, and then we have several on the technical section, which we'll get to Hartej, and then a couple on partnerships we'll work back to Abigail. So with that, one of the first questions that came up is for Hadia, and this one is, does the CBA need to be finalized by the time of the application is submitted, or is it enough to simply outline the plan and get it signed during the grant period? Hadia.
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. You can absolutely outline a plan to get the CBA signed, and a good practice would be to reference all the potential stakeholder groups, so both community as well as labor, and that you've been in talks with, and talk about how those talks have been progressing. You might want to emphasize, the significance of those groups to the project. For instance, is that the biggest union, or is that the most impacted labor group, or is this the most marginalized, underrepresented community group, or is it a disadvantaged community per the definitions of a disadvantaged community? And that should be able to meet the criteria that's outlined in the FOA on page 34, which says to include any plans to develop a skilled labor pool and provide community benefits through workforce and community agreements.
Great, thank you, Hadia. Very much appreciated. Ben, this was another question that I'll pass to you, also related to CBAs. Does the CBA require a union even if the company is non-unionized?
Good question. So a CBA in form is agnostic as to who signs the CBA, right? It is community groups, but I'll just say it is typically some of the most successful CBAs have included representation from both the workforce and local community groups. And representation of the local workforce typically means a union. I'll also just note, just to be clear, you better position your application for acceptance if you have a union, and if you work with that union to ensure that there are quality jobs, workforce development, and ideally a CBA. So that's kind of cross-cutting. It's pretty inherent in a lot of what I said in the Investing in American Workforce and a lot of what Hadia named as well. But just to be crystal clear, you are better positioning your application for acceptance if you are working with a union.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And another question building on that one is for the labor engagement portions of the CBA, that's required for even brand new construction, and even does that even apply if the jobs won't be actually working for 2 to 3 more years in the future, right? Does the CBA still apply? How does that happen for brand new construction and jobs that don't exist yet but are many years in the future?
Hadia, I don't know if you want to take that. I can take it first. Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So I would say if you're looking at specifically construction jobs, I would also point you to project labor agreements, which is another form of agreement that I mentioned. And that is often used. It's a very tried and true practice, been used for years, to have a mutually beneficial agreement between a company and a construction union about specific benefits for the workers. And for the company, again, as I named, the value proposition is that it ensures a more timely project, ensures a skilled workforce, especially in a tight labor market, something that a lot of companies are looking for right now. So I would suggest that if you're really concerned primarily about the construction phase, not to dissuade you from a CBA, because that's also important for both operations and construction workers, but a PLA, a project labor agreement, might be an agreement you're looking for.
Great, thanks, Ben. And another question here asking if perhaps you and Hadia, well, maybe Ben go first, is speak a little bit more about labor neutrality and labor peace agreements in lieu of union engagement.
My quick response on that is that labor neutrality and labor peace agreements do not exist without a union engagement, right? So just to say, that is, you would need to talk with a union to publicly commit to being neutral with regard to any particular organizing drive, right? That is, and I just want to be clear, a labor neutrality agreement is not saying we are ex ante blessing a collective bargaining agreement with this union. It's a neutrality agreement. What you're committing to is non-interference, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that there already is a union that has a collective bargaining agreement in your company. But what it does mean is that if said union would like to start to organize your company and try to do an organizing drive, that the company is beforehand committing, usually publicly, to not interfere in that organizing drive.
Got it. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate the responses there. Hadia, we've got one for you here related to the social life cycle assessment. And is that required for community engagement on a given project?
So the required elements that have to be absolutely submitted with the full application are listed, I believe, on page 116 of the FOA. And that is not a standalone document that is required for this particular funding opportunity. A lot of the elements that are involved in conducting that type of analysis actually do fall under the community and labor engagement section. It's the same type of research, the same type of analysis, and it might be simpler to actually just use the subheadings to format that information. That way, you're still covering it. It's not a technical required section. And then we have the 4 sort of required pieces that speak to community, labor, and environmental in our slides, and where that information can be found. So that would be my response to that. There was one additional question that I did want to flag, which was about letters of support. That was a question saying that would letters of support from like off-takers be of interest? And that, I would say, information is on page 52 of the FOA, where they talk specifically about supply chain and off-take agreements. And they say that any letters of commitment should be submitted in a separate attachment in OCED Exchange. So that is absolutely, that's something that you can absolutely do to the person that asked.
Great, thanks. Thanks for those questions. I'm one more for you, Hadia, and I know that this was addressed during your comments as well, but could you just circle back on underrepresented and what that means, and the tools and resources that folks have available to make sure that they're doing their analysis correctly and identifying groups correctly?
Absolutely. So for underrepresented groups, they can be both on the community side, but then also specifically and particularly on the labor side in terms of hiring individuals from underrepresented groups. So I'll start on the community side. So the broad groups that identified that were individuals with disabilities, veterans, formerly returned citizens, which is the term we use to describe formerly incarcerated persons. And we also include groups that, because of childcare needs or elder care needs, may traditionally be overlooked. And then it also actually includes groups that lack access to like broadband, for instance, so they may not have, they may not be as connected. The simple, way to consolidate, to actually find where the groups that you may not have considered is to contact the local civil rights office, and both local government will have a civil rights office and the state government will also have a civil rights office, and they tend to interface the most with these groups. So you can not only get local community organization contacts, but you can get a bigger list that you might be overlooking. And then on the labor side, the groups that tend to be traditionally excluded include members of the individuals that are part of tribal entities or identify as indigenous. Women, particularly women of color, are also underrepresented in the workforce. And the DOE has a minority business division that specializes in outreach and connecting the broader population and the public to opportunities in the energy transition. So you should absolutely contact them and get their help with even, promoting upcoming projects or providing resources on how to reach, for instance, MSIs, which are minority serving institutions. So a lot of those students would be considered underrepresented in the workforce. So those are like my 2 pro tips.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you, Hadia and Ben, for those. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A roster for other pieces that come up. Anything else that you all wanted to further comment on that maybe didn't come up as a question?
I just wanted to invite continued conversation. If there are follow-up conversations or questions that people want to have with respect to a specific application, I don't want to speak for Hadia, but I'm pretty sure both of us would be happy to talk about community benefits. We are fielding lots of very specific questions, and so I know there are a couple about unions. If there are particular questions about how to engage with unions, etc., just would invite. Feel free to reach out, and we're happy to talk brass tacks.
Yeah, let's actually flip to the next slide that includes our contact information, just so folks can do that. I think folks are well aware we're in the Q&A portion, so we can just leave this up for folks while we continue the Q&A. Hartej, if I can invite you back to the virtual stage, please. We're going to put you on the hot seat for a couple of technical questions. Ben and Hadia, we can let you step back. Thank you again. Several items related to the application. It's the technical portions of the application. First one is, how do you estimate baseline within a TEA and how much granularity is expected?
Hey, Brian, great question. So for all topic areas, applicants are going to need to define the state-of-the-art benchmark to compare expected results. And so what this benchmark is it represents the best commercially available off-the-shelf technology that's going to be used to build a similar industrial facility today, including, the associated emissions, the costs, et cetera. And so for projects at existing facilities, applicants will need to create a baseline of their current standard operations to compare with the project expectations and the industry benchmark. And so for this current operations piece, the current operations baseline should represent steady state operating conditions. And important to note, if an eligible facility has already made substantial decarbonization improvements to their processes, then the potential for reductions via carbon intensity may be less than what was outlined in the table that describes the carbon intensity targets for each topic area.
Got it. Thanks, Hartej. Another question here is, how much detail should be included in the permitting workflow overview section?
Yep. Also, very, very good question. So essentially, at this stage, what the permitting workflow overview is a permitting timeline, and so this timeline should detail the permit name, the relevant agency, whether it's federal, state, or local, or tribal, the obtain date or the planned obtain date, and identifying any key roadblocks to obtaining that permit, and a mitigation plan. It's important to note that phase 1, which is the phase immediately following the full application phase, if you're selected, which is called detailed project planning, it will offer more time and funding to perform more due diligence on permitting.
Got it. Thanks. So helpful clarifications there. Next one up is related to the why did my project qualify section, and what is meant by deep decarbonization in terms of why a given project may have qualified.
Yep, excellent question. So what deep decarbonization means is that your project addresses the % carbon intensity reduction targets defined as tons CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product. So deep decarbonization means that it addresses those reduction targets outlined in the FOA. So those targets, just to remind everyone, were 75% for topics 1 and 3, and 50% for topic 2. These the FOA also includes stretch targets, which is a 90% reduction for all 3 topics. So that's what's implied by deep decarbonization.
Excellent. Thank you, Hartej, for more clarifications there. This next question up is related to the different sections and the structure of information that might be overlapping between a couple of different sections. So, in the proposal, the business plan section, there's requirements for commercial feasibility, growth plan, and then there's a financial plan section that are overlapping. So how should applicants think about potentially repeating information in those various sections of commercial feasibility and growth plans?
Yes, it's a great question. So in all of these applications, page numbers are of the essence. So you're always running up against that constraint. Best practice is if information is already stated earlier in the application, what you can do is just reference the reader to that specific section to avoid having to paste redundant information and use up valuable page space. So that's just the best practice. Make sure you do address it though, because as the DOE reviewer is going through your application, they want to make sure that you're checking that box in that particular section. But you don't have to put redundant information in. Best practice is just to reference the reader or the reviewer to a previous section where that's explained.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good one. And I'm reminded of one of your best practices that you emphasized before of always keep the audience in mind and make it easy
Absolutely.
for the DOE reviewers to see their pieces. We know that they're going to get more than 100 full applications to review. So again, you want to make it easy and straightforward for those reviewers to find the information that they're looking for. And in some sense, this is a paint by numbers exercise, right? Like, this is not the room for, for massive creativity in the structure. Right. It's, follow the form.
Exactly.
Great. Thanks, Hartej. Were there other topics or items that that came up that you wanted to either reemphasize or otherwise address before we move to a quick question or two for Abigail in the partnership section?
The only additional thing I'll mention, Brian, is we received a question that Hadi addressed on letters of commitment. The only thing I'll reiterate is that the DOE wants to avoid having you submit generic letters of support. So folks that have nothing to do with your projects and just write a very, very generic letter of support saying, hey, I like your project, I support your project, but in the future execution of your project have nothing to do with the actual project itself. The DOE wants to avoid that, right? So letters of commitment from off-takers definitely encouraged. Please reference the FOA and how you should put those together. Community organizations that are directly going to be part of the project, definitely include those, but generic letters of support, try to avoid those.
Excellent. Thanks for that clarification, Hartej. All right. Well, we've got Abigail back on the virtual stage here. Hartej, we can let you go. Thank you, sir. So Abigail, one of the questions on partnerships here was, how should folks think about university partners being involved with program evaluation, or frankly, other partners being involved in that program evaluation?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Here, and I mean, certainly depends on likely the university and kind of the expertise available. in the university on kind of which pieces of the application they might be, helpful on. I mentioned, national labs potentially being helpful on some of the technical pieces like LCA, TEA, but there could be, university research labs that have expertise in that as well. So that's an area that you could, certainly bring in university partners. Or if there are universities who are working more on the community engagement side, then certainly they could potentially provide support and help on how you actually go about that. So I think it'll kind of depend on, the expertise available in, the university, whether it's one you already have connections to, whether you're trying to engage one that is close to the project location itself. But I would certainly encourage folks to, think kind of creatively on all the pieces that they could actually be helpful on, and not just, certain pieces.
Got it. Yes, that's helpful. Abigail, was there anything else that came up during today's discussion? Any points that you wanted to either bring to the fore or otherwise re-emphasize about to our audience here today?
Yeah, it's been mentioned a couple of times now on kind of those letters of commitment, offtake. I do think that's going to be a critical piece that DOE is looking for as a criterion. So whether you are able to get a letter of commitment, or perhaps you're already a supplier for another company and you're able to bring them in and have them say, they're supportive of this project and continuing, that relationship, especially with a lower carbon product. There are also many different existing kind of low carbon product commitment frameworks out there that you may have heard of, like the First Movers Coalition, and they have a list of, member companies who are committing to steel and aluminum and cement and things like that. So if you're looking for ideas of, companies to reach out to, then that could be certainly starting places. They've also, the commitments typically list a specific target level of kind of emissions reductions. So then if you can link that back to your anticipated, carbon intensity per unit of product and say, well, I'm going to be able to meet this existing commitment that's out there, that's another way to kind of show that market viability and potential offtake if you don't have, a specific offtaker in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Appreciate the input here, Abigail, and the reminders on and ideas for helping folks to submit a very competitive application. So with that, we're going to close up the webinar so we can, I'll just cover a couple quick housekeeping things here as we wrap. As you can see on screen, we've got our contact information. We look forward to continuing the dialogue with your questions, large or small. We look forward to seeing you at future webinars in this series. Hopefully we'll see many of you on July 17th, where we will cover the full suite of available grants, tax incentives, and loan guarantees outside of this specific grant program, so that you can potentially take advantage of those as well. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded. The recording will be available publicly after we do some cleanup on the files shortly on the RMI YouTube channel. Also, for all registered attendees, we will send out a copy of these slides or make these slides available to you. And note that there is appendix slides, which we did not show here, which contain additional reference information. And final reminder to keep tabs on the DOE OCED website for any reminders, updates, changes. Anything that comes directly from DOE is what drives on their deadlines and their requirements, so stay close to that. Finally, thank you very much to our panelists and presenters, Abigail, Hartej, Ben, and Hadia. Also, a big shout out to the RMI events team and others behind the scenes that have made this possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. With that, wishing everyone a pleasant rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.